Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we'll be discussing a few things, including a few signings. There was a trade that recently happened. On top of that, we have a few trade rumors to discuss, and the start of the NHL season is now upon us. So we'll get to all of that and more coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. I want to kick things off today with the news that the NHL season is back underway. We had a few games over in the Global Series in Prague over the weekend, as the Nashville Predators and the San Jose Sharks played back-to-back games over in the Czech Republic as part of the Global Series for the NHL. The Preds won both games, 4-1 on Friday and 3-2 on Saturday, and showed that they do look like a really dominant team this year. It seems like their off-season acquisitions have been helping them. Nino Niederreiter and Ryan McDonough both had really good showings in their first two games. Also, young forward Kiefer Sherwood, who was a depth acquisition in the offseason, had a few points as well. And the Preds look like they could be a lethal team contending for a playoff spot this year. As for the Sharks, there were a couple of players like Luke Cunnin, who had a goal, and Mark-Edward Vlasic, who seems to be like he's the older Mark-Edward Vlasic, who was a good defenseman, and not like the Mark-Edward Vlasic of the last few years where he has been a bottom pairing defenseman. But I do think that while the Sharks had a few good bright spots into their lineup this past weekend, especially their goaltending with Reimer and Kakinen playing quite well, I do think that the Sharks do look like a team who probably will finish bottom 10 in the league again this year. I don't see much improvement from last year, and I think that the games over the weekend did show that. So I do think that the Preds look like a team who could make for a playoff run, and the Sharks look like a team who is probably not going to make any sort of playoff noise this year. But it was really good to see some NHL action over the weekend. And then we had the starting day, which was on Tuesday, as the New York Rangers and the Tampa Bay Bolts played in the opening game in North America of the regular season. And it was a really good game, really tight, competitive matchup between these two teams. They both went to the Eastern Conference Final last year, so it's quite easy to say that it was going to be a competitive. Both teams look pretty similar to what they were last year. I do think both teams may have regressed a tiny bit, but the Rangers were the team to come away with the win. They were able to win 3-1 over the Tampa Bay Lightning. Mika Zibanejad scored twice, and the Bolts didn't capitalize on all their power play opportunities, only getting 1 on 6. So I do think that the Bolts look a little bit rusty, but that should wear off really quickly. I think both teams are going to be at the very least top 3 in their division, if not top 2. And I think that these two teams are going to be powerhouses in the Eastern Conference. The Rangers should be a good team. They showed it on Tuesday with Zibanejad getting 2 goals, and even their depth with Barclay Goodrow getting a goal. So this Rangers team, I think, looks pretty good. As for the Bolts, I think it was just the Rangers were better in this game, and I think that the Bolts should be able to start winning more and more as the season goes on. But definitely a really good competitive game between these two teams. And lastly, we had the Vegas Golden Knights and the LA Kings play the nightcap game on Tuesday. It was a really good, close game. Both teams played really well. I think that Logan Thompson, the young Golden Knights goalie, did really well. Jonathan Quick was absolutely amazing in goal, facing 51 shots. But it was the Golden Knights who came away with the 4-3 victory. Back and forth game, there were a couple of lead changes in this game, and there was a lot of goal scoring in the third period. But eventually it was Golden Knights captain Mark Stone that gave the Golden Knights the regulation win, as he scored with 25 seconds left to put the Golden Knights on top in Game 1. I do think that new faces like Phil Kessel in Vegas and Kevin Fiala in LA did quite well in their debuts with their new teams. And I think that both these teams should be destined for the playoffs. They look ready and better. I think a healthy Golden Knights team is going to be scary to play against. And a Kings team who definitely improved last year. They made the playoffs last year with a beat-up blue line and a worse offense than this year. So I definitely think that this team in LA is going to do great this year, and I think Vegas is going to be scary to play against. And I think both teams definitely have a shot at making the playoffs in the Pacific Division this year. Now that's all I want to talk about for the start of the season. We're going to get through lots of more games over the next few months, and we can't wait to see what transpires. Who's going to start well, who's going to not start well, what moves we're going to see for the teams who don't start well, and how is these standings going to shake out. I can't wait to see. But that's all for the start of the season for now. We're going to go over to some signings that have happened recently. The Montreal Canadiens were able to sign 2 top-end prospects for them. They signed Logan Mailloux to a 3-year entry-level contract, and that will carry a cap hit of $898,000. Now, Mailloux was a first-round pick, 31st overall, in the 2021 draft, and he still has some way to work before he becomes an NHL roster player. I think he's at least 2 to 3 years away right now, and the Canadiens do have a deep blue line with a lot of prospects on it, and a few that did end up making the roster this year. But I do think that he's going to have to wait at least a few years to make the NHL roster. I think he probably has this year to play in the OHL, grow his game, then he maybe plays in the AHL the year after, and then maybe he can play in the NHL at that point. But I do think that he could be a decent third-pair defenseman in time for the Montreal Canadiens, and I do think that he could be a productive player for those Canadiens. As for the other one, the Montreal Canadiens also signed Owen Beck to a 3-year entry-level contract, and that deal will carry an AAV of $917,000 for him. Now, Beck was the 33rd pick in the 2022 NHL draft, so a second-round pick, but he did not look out of place at all in Montreal training camp. He actually looks like one of the better players. Now, I think that he still needs a year of development in the OHL, which is where he will probably play this year. But in the next year, I could see him be a third-line center for the Montreal Canadiens. I think Beck stands a good chance to be a good middle six center for Montreal in, at the very least, a year. Maybe 2, but probably a year. And I would say that he could be a really good power forward for the Montreal Canadiens. I think that they have a lot of center depth right now, which could have been the reason they led him to the OHL for this year. But I don't think it'll be too long before Owen Beck makes it to the NHL and ends up starting to be a good point-producing forward for the Canadiens. As for the other signing, it wasn't an extension, and it was an extension that a lot of people thought would probably get done before the season started. It just took a while to get announced. But the Calgary Flames were able to sign new offseason acquisition, Mackenzie Wegar, to an 8-year extension that it will have a cap hit of $6.25 million. Now, Weegar came over in the Matthew Tkachuk trade from the Florida Panthers and had been playing quite well with the Panthers recently. He had, for the first few years of his career, been a good third-pair defenseman who could be utilized in a few different situations. But over the past 2 years, he has become an amazing point-producing defenseman. 2 years ago, in the shortened season, he had 36 points in 56 games, which was pretty good. But he topped that in this year's season by putting up 44 points in 80 games this year. And he looks like he's going to be a really good point-producing defenseman for the Calgary Flames. The Flames definitely like Weegar's game right now, and he's definitely going to be a good defenseman for the Calgary Flames. Now, he played mostly on the first pair last year with Aaron Ekblad, but I don't think that's where he starts the season. I think that the pair of Anderson and Hanifin, who was the top pair last year, should probably remain together and as the top pair, but I think Weegar could play second pair minutes for the Calgary Flames. I think if he played second pair minutes and had maybe some better matchups, he could end up being a better point-producing defenseman than he was last year with the Florida Panthers. I think there was a lot of weight on him when Aaron Ekblad got injured, and that did lead him to being that good top pair defenseman. But I also think that if he had a lesser role, he could be a 50 to 60 point producing defenseman. I do also think that the $6.25 million cap hit is really good for the Calgary Flames. I think he could have hit $7 to $8 million on the open market, so getting him for 6.25 is a really nice deal for the Calgary Flames. And I think that they should absolutely be thrilled with this extension. And for the next 2, 3, maybe 4 years, where they have this window where they can definitely be a Stanley Cup contender, Weegar is going to help them tremendously to try and become a Stanley Cup champion. So these are the 3 signings that have happened over the past few days. Next, we're going to get into a trade that happened recently, and that is a swap of prospects between the Edmonton Oilers and the St. Louis Blues, as the Oilers sent young defensive prospect Dmitry Samorukov to the St. Louis Blues in exchange for young bottom 6 forward Kostin. Now, both players were taken in the 2017 draft. Kostin was the last pick of the first round, and Samorukov was the 3rd round pick. But both players looked like they could use fresh starts. Kostin had been in and out of the lineup the past few years with the St. Louis Blues, mostly in a bottom 6 role. He was able to manage to get into 40 games last year with the St. Louis Blues and put up 9 points. But the Blues still have a pretty deep roster, and there are prospects ahead of Kostin that would probably be able to make more of an impact. So moving Kostin for a defensive prospect made sense for the Blues. I do think Kostin still is a really good player. For the Oilers, this is going to be a really good acquisition because Kostin should be able to start the season in the AHL. He cleared waivers already, so I wouldn't be surprised if he did start in the AHL. But if they run into injury trouble or they do end up trading a guy like Puljujärvi, then I do think Kostin could come into the NHL and be a productive bottom 6 forward for them. Probably playing on the 3rd line, I would say. But I do think Kostin could be a decent bottom 6 forward for the Edmonton Oilers and maybe help them make the decision to move a guy like Puljujärvi. If they know they have a guy like Kostin in the minors who could come up and be a good, decent bottom 6 forward, it might make them more willing to trade a guy like Puljujärvi. As for the Blues, they, like I said, have a really good, decent forward group. So acquiring a guy like Samorukov on the blue line should help the Blues. I think Samorukov is going to be a good defenseman for the Blues. The Blues did run into injury trouble in training camp, with Scandella and Peronovich going to be out long term. And I do think Peronovich was probably going to be a good 3rd pair defenseman for the Blues this year. So I definitely think that Samorukov should be able to challenge for a roster spot. Now, he also cleared waivers, so it also wouldn't surprise me if he started in the AHL. But with the depleted blue line, if there's an injury, he should definitely be called up. And even if there's no injury, I do think he could challenge with a guy like Niko Mikkola for the 3rd pair spot on the left side. And I definitely think that trading from a position of strength to help a position of weakness definitely help the Blues. And I think that the addition of Samorukov will greatly improve the Blues' blue line, at least in the short term, while Scandella and Peronovich continue to get healthy. So that's the trade that I wanted to discuss today. Good move for both sides, with the Blues getting Samorukov to help their ailing blue line, and the Oilers getting a bottom 6 forward who will probably start in the AHL, but could be a good depth forward for them into the season when they run into injuries. So good move for both teams, and I think both prospects needed to have a fresh start, and I think that switching teams was the right move for both guys. Now we're going on to some trade rumors, as there were a few trades before the season started in training camp, but there weren't as many as I was expecting, and that does leave us with a few players to still be in trade discussions right now. So to start with, we're going to start with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, the Penguins were reportedly interested in moving Pierre Olivier Joseph for the right price. The young defenseman has had a difficult time making the roster, but he was able to make the roster this year, but it did come at the expense of a couple of players. They had to move waivers exempt Ty Smith, who they acquired in the John Marino deal, and send him down to the minors. And they also had to waive Mark Friedman, who is a good 7th to 8th defenseman for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and cleared. So he should be able to start the season in the AHL and be a good top pair defenseman there. But I do think that Friedman and Smith aren't going to stay the whole season in the AHL. I think they're more likely to be called up at some point, either due to injuries or things. But I think Smith is a good third pair defenseman, and Friedman should be the spare in the NHL roster. So I would not be at all surprised if Pierre Olivier Joseph was traded at some point earlier in the season. I think that with a few teams probably running into injury trouble and needing a good defenseman, they could end up paying the asking price that the Pens want. I think that a lot of teams thought that we weren't going to give you anything if the Penguins were just going to put him on waivers and they could claim him there. But the Penguins obviously showed that they're not going to put Joseph on waivers and lose him for nothing. He's definitely a valuable piece to that roster. So I do think that if a team were to give the Penguins what they want and pay at the price for Pierre Olivier Joseph, that the Penguins should be willing to move him, and then they could call up a guy like Ty Smith, who could fill in on the third pair and be a good defenseman, and they'd still have some pretty incredible depth on the blue line. But I just think that Joseph being moved is a very likely possibility, and I think that it could happen sometime in the very near future. But I think that Joseph moving is a very likely possibility for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and I think that he could end up being moved early in the season due to the fact that I think Smith and Freeman will show that they are definitely NHL players and are probably a little bit too good to be playing in the AHL. As for the Arizona Coyotes, there was a lot of talk in the offseason and training camp that Jacob Chychrun would end up being moved by the Arizona Coyotes, but that never came to fruition. There was a lot of talk about the Yotes trying to move him. Apparently, the Coyotes came to him last offseason and said that they would be willing to be traded, and he said yes. But now, with the direction the Arizona Coyotes are heading in, it seems more likely that he wants out more than the Coyotes want to trade him. Now, Chychrun is coming off a down year, only putting up 21 points in 47 games, but he did have a lot of injuries last year. And the year prior, he had a breakout season, putting up 41 points in the shortened season and having 18 goals. So a lot of teams are still hoping that they're getting the 18-goal Chychrun from the shortened season, but his injury history and injury right now is complicating things. He's starting the season on injury reserve, which is going to hurt his value a bit, but I think that the best solution for the Coyotes right now would be to wait until Chychrun is once again healthy, then reinsert him into the lineup for about 5, 10, 15 games to show other teams that he is still the point-producing defenseman that they would want to acquire. And then once they have shown that Chychrun is still good, healthy, and can play really good top 4 minutes, then they should try as fast as they can to move him. I think that a distraction for the team is probably not the best. We saw last year with Eichel, I know this is a different situation, but the distraction with Jack Eichel, who was a star player in Buffalo, wanting out, really did sidetrack the Sabres. And once Eichel was moved, the Sabres looked that they started to grow with the team. And I think that if Chychrun is moved earlier in the season, the Yotes could end up surprising people because they are going to become closer as a team. But I definitely think that with Chychrun not wanting to be there, he could be a bad locker room influence for the team. And I think a distraction like that could worsen the team in the long run. So I think a Chychrun trade at some point earlier in the season, hopefully, should be expected. I do think teams who could be inquiring could be the Ottawa Senators, as Ottawa has definitely been interested in Chychrun over the offseason. Over the offseason and training camp, Ottawa was the front runner for Chychrun, and I think they still are. They have a okay blue line, but one that could really use an upgrade, and I think they have the prospects that the Coyotes could want to make a Chychrun deal work. I think that the St. Louis Blues are another team who could end up making a Chychrun trade. I do think that the Blues should be able to make a deal to improve their blue line. They don't have too bad of a blue line, but an improvement is definitely something that the Blues should be looking into, especially given the fact that they are a playoff team and maybe even cup contender. And even though it would cost a prospect or two, I do think it would be a smart move for the Blues. And the Blue Jackets, who, even though Chychrun decided earlier in the offseason that he didn't really like the direction the Jackets were going and didn't really want him to be traded there, but now that the Jackets look like a new team who could contend for playoffs either this year or next, it does sound like Chychrun will be a little bit more willing to go there. And even though the Jackets would have to give up a prospect or two to do it, I think it would really help speed up that retool type thing that they've been doing over the past 2 years and get them back into the playoffs. So definitely keep an eye on the Chychrun trade. I want to know what you think Chychrun could be worth, and what sort of a trade package do you think would end up bringing Chychrun to a team. And lastly, we're going to talk about the Montreal Canadiens. Now, the Canadiens had a lot of forwards, and we were trying to figure out how they would make sure that they kept all of their forwards. A lot of people thought that they would have been a trade before the start of the season, but that didn't happen. They were able to move Paul Byron to LTIR and Yoel Armia to IR, so that was able to give them 14 forwards, and that was enough to fit under their 23-man roster. So for the short term, they are going to be okay. But when Yoel Armia gets back, someone will have to go on waivers if they don't make a trade. So I still think that there could be a deal. Now, Paul Byron's situation is a little bit murky. It does sound like he could be out for a longer period of time, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. But when Yoel Armia gets back off of IR, he will make 15 forwards, and they can't have really 15 forwards on their group. So they would either have to maybe move Yuri Slafkovsky, who did end up making the team, down given the fact he's waivers exempt, or the more likely route is I still think they maybe trade one. Now, with Armia coming off of injury reserve and not being too good of a point producer, I do think he is probably the least likely to be moved right now. But I do think that either Mike Hoffman or Christian Dvorak are probably moved, and I think Hoffman is probably the most likely. I think that Hoffman is still a good middle six winger who is only making $4.5 million over the next 2 seasons. He is a good scoring forward. Hoffman hasn't been the 20-goal scorer that he was with the Ottawa Senators and Florida Panthers in the most recent seasons, but I do think that in the right situation, he could still be a good goal-scoring forward. He did have a decent 35 points in 67 games last year and was over 15 goals. But I do think that if Armia is healthy and needs to be activated off of IR, that Hoffman should still be moved, and he should be the one to go to make room for Armia and free up cap space and a roster spot for the Montreal Canadiens forward group. So that is all I'm going to be discussing today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I also do a blog, which I will leave a link to in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for next week's video. See you guys soon.